Hello, my name is Eduardo Torres and I'm a PhD student from the Trinity College Dublin, and today I'm going to present my talk on title Fictional Characters as Public Institutions. So, in the general scheme of things, I'm going to have a brief introduction speaking about fictional characters, and then there's a section on reference, and the second section is on existence and persistence conditions, and then identity and individuation conditions, and finally I end up with some objections and remarks to my paper. So when speaking about fictional characters, my proposal for this talk is an exercise in descriptive metaphysics that seeks to articulate a theory of fiction embedded in our literary practices and their set of social relations properly construed. In general, my account follows that of Amy Lee Thomasson in her Fictional Characters and Literary Practices from 2003. However, I offer some modifications regarding the semantics of fictional characters, as well as their conditions of identity and individuation, and in particular, their public and social nature. So I defend three theses in this talk, in this paper. The first one is that fictional characters are cultural artifacts, which means they are created, actual, contingent, abstract, temporal, and public. The second thesis states that a directly referential semantics properly captures all thought and talk about fictional characters. A name N, used to refer to a fictional character N, lacks any sort of descriptive content. The creation of a fictional character involves a hypostasizing use of the name N, which grounds its reference. Subsequent reference is preserved by causal historical chains. The third and last hypothesis, and perhaps the most controversial, is that the identity conditions of a fictional character N are not as strict as others have argued. In fact, due to its social and public nature, fictional characters do not associate any particular set of nuclear or core essential properties which guarantees identity across time or work. It is only the extra-fictional properties related to its creation, author, place, time, which can be appealed to in order to warrant identity. So in the first section, I'm going to talk about reference. It's through reference that I start my investigation about fictional characters. So it seems that our ordinary talk about fictional characters seems to commit us to the existence of certain abstract entities, namely fictional characters. Consider the following sentences. So first, sentence A, Mrs Coulter was married to Eduardo Coulter. Sentence B, Mrs Coulter's given name was Marisa de la Mer. C, Mrs Coulter is one of the main characters in Philip Pullman's His Dark Materials trilogy. And D, Mrs Coulter doesn't really exist. All of these four sentences make reference to Mrs Coulter, who is not a real person. It's a fictional character. Moreover, I believe we would agree, perhaps with certain qualifications, that all these four sentences are true. But if there is no such thing as Mrs Coulter, then our sentences cannot be true. Yet if this is the case, then most of our discourse about fiction is either false or meaningless. It would be hard to regard it as meaningless, yet we also find a certain resistance to call it fake. What would it take to make sentence A, B, and C, and D true? Well, it's very simple. For there to be a fictional character, Mrs Coulter, to which we are referring. However, certain ontological scruples may prevent us from granting existence to something as intangible as a fictional character. I will argue that such prejudices are rather uncalled for. Prima facie, there seems to be two related problems with the realist approach, at least from a merely semantic perspective. First, let's grant that sentences from 1 to D, from A to D, all express the same proposition. The true proposition that all express true propositions because there is a fictional character named Mrs Coulter. Nonetheless, there is a contradiction from the start. The truth of 1A, 1B, and 1C is inconsistent with the truth of 1D. For how can sentences about Mrs Coulter be true if Mrs Coulter doesn't really exist. Secondly, one may argue that this is so because 1a and 1b are to be evaluated as intra-fictional sentences, that is, within the fiction from which Mrs Coulter is part of, whereas 1c and 1d are extra-fictional sentences. But this doesn't solve the problem, since 1c and 1d are still inconsistent with each other. So, if we take fictional characters to exist, we run pretty soon into contradictions. The first inconsistency has been called the problem of negative existentials, which can be avoided by resisting realism about fictional characters. The second inconsistency has to do with literal truth and fictional contexts, and it seems to hold whether or not you adopt a form of realism. For an anti-realist still has to explain the apparent truth of 1c, which clashes with the truth of 1d, which in turn is taken to be true by the anti-realist. So, I propose that we actually, giving to realism, accept a form of realism in the shape of an artifactual theory. An artifactual theory of fiction has the advantage of both preserving and explaining our intuitions about the truth of sentences 1a to 1d. The artifactual solution to both the problem of negative existentials and fictional context implies, 1, that negative existentials come out true because a sentence like 1d is to be understood as used to make an assertion that there is not a real flesh and blood person whose name is Mrs Coulter, but only an abstract artifact, a fictional character. That when speaking from within a fictional context, sentences like 1a and 1b are to be understood as elliptically embedded to an intentional operator, an operator like according to the fiction, which shifts the circumstance of evaluation from the actual world to the world presented in the corresponding fiction. Third is that when speaking from within an extra-fictional context, like in sentence C, 1c, the sentence that says that Mrs Coulter is the main villain in Philip Pullman's trilogy, the referent of the name Mrs Coulter is the actual existent fictional character, Mrs Coulter, who happens to be one of the villains in Philip Pullman's trilogy. Now, when specifying the existence and persistence conditions of artifactual theory of fictional characters, we have to say that a fictional character comes into existence through a literary act of creation, most of the times by writing it within a piece of fiction, but it could also be orally transmitted within a piece of fiction, of course. To secure reference, the fictional character must be made public. A secret, private fictional character could be maybe thought of, but could it be referred to? I do not see how. A fictional character persists or remains in existence as long as our acts of reference breach a block. That is, the causal historical chains of reference can be traced back at least to a community who uses the name with the same intended reference. Third, the fictional character Mrs Coulter will cease to exist the moment no speaker is aware of its referent, perhaps because all of Pullman's work has been destroyed and no one remembers any of it. So it might seem that the grounding of reference of a fictional character, it is, of course, an important event to secure its referent. It could be the case that the actual facts about such grounding are ignored or forgotten, without implying by itself the disappearing of such a fictional character. In the case of fictional characters who originated within a non-written tradition, think of characters in folklore tales or mythology or religion, this would explain why we can still successfully speak about them, even though we may not be able to accurately point to the reference grounding event. A fictional character, when it comes to its conditions of identity and individuation, is a cultural artifact, and this means that it is created because it comes into existence. It is actual because it is an entity in the actual world, of the actual world. It is contingent because it could have failed to exist. If, for example, Philip Pullman wasn't born, probably Mrs Coulter wouldn't exist. It is an abstract entity, but only in the sense that it cannot be located in space. Though you might argue that it can be located in time. Temporal, for it can cease to exist, and therefore it is not eternal. And public, even though in the Western literary tradition the creation of a fictional character is linked to a particular author or authors, its nature within a fiction is nonetheless public, in the sense that it can be modified by subsequent authors. It is, in the case of intrafictional characters, or fictional characters within a piece of fiction, we can say that they share the same existing conditions as a fictional character. They are written within a piece of fiction. The same applies not only to fictional characters per se, that is, to people or persons, but for fictional places and fictional objects as well. I'm going to explain this again with Mrs Coulter, the character of Mrs Coulter, because perhaps my most apparently controversial thesis is the idea that fictional characters lack any essential properties in fiction. Let me elaborate on this. So, I'm going to give a series of facts, historical facts, by the way. Mrs Coulter was created by Philip Pullman and first appeared in his novel Northern Lights in 1995. So we might not know for sure when exactly was the character created. You could ask whether it was brought into existence at the time where Pullman first started in his head, or was it at the first time he written it down? Was it at the time that someone read about it? That's a bit fuzzy, it's a bit indeterminate. These are puzzling questions, but perhaps not truly relevant for a theory of fiction, a bit not at this level. We can always trace her origin, at least to the publication of the book. Well, in that novel, Mrs Coulter is presented as being dark-haired. Later on, the novel was adapted into a film and released in 2007. In the film The Golden Compass, Mrs Coulter, who is brilliantly played by Nicole Kidman, is presented as having blonde hair. Later on, Pullman regretted, he liked the change so much that he didn't only publicly regretted not having written her as a blonde, but in the prequel published 10 years later, he made her blonde. In 2019, another adaptation of the original novel came out, this time as a television series. Mrs Coulter is presented once again as having dark hair. Though perhaps a tangential example, the general idea is that Mrs Coulter could have been presented in another piece of fiction under basically any guise. One can imagine a fan fiction where Mrs Coulter is not named Mrs Coulter because she never married Eduardo Coulter. In fact, in the audiobook story by Philip Pullman, The Collector, Mrs Coulter is not yet named Coulter, for in the story's timeline, she hasn't yet married Coulter. Emphasizing the public nature of a fictional character, I argue that Mrs Coulter could and can lack any of the properties attributed to her in the fiction, in the original novels. She can be presented within a certain piece of fiction as being taller, being not a villain but a hero, being married to Astrid instead of Coulter, not being the mother of Lyra, not being British, being older, younger. She could be presented in a different timeline, in a different place or in a different world, and moreover, she could even be presented as not female. She could be Mr. Coulter in a gender-bended fiction, for example. Since fictional characters are solely cultural artifacts, they lack any of the properties ascribed to them in the fiction. The character Mrs Coulter, qua fictional character, is neither a woman nor a mother. It is not a she because it is not a woman. It is a fictional character. And since it is a fictional character, it has no hair, no personality, no personal traits whatsoever. Qua fictional character, however, Mrs Coulter has an origin, a history, and you can find it referenced across several different works of fiction. Not only written works, but also films, television series, theatre, plays and paintings. And it could also be referenced in works of non-fiction, just as I'm doing now, at the moment. Unlike actual people, whose metaphysical traits appear to be somehow restricted according to some general held intuitions. For example, though I'm a wholly contingent being, my mortal profile is not entirely flexible. I could have grown up in a different place. I could have failed to be working on metaphysics, yet I wouldn't be myself if my genetic profile were distinct. Fictional characters are not restricted in this sense. A fictional character can be presented in a certain piece of fiction, basically under any guise. The limits of the guise of a given fictional character are determined, and only in a weak sense, intrafictionally, according to the given laws of consistency of a certain piece of fiction. And I say this only in a weak sense, because imagination seems to be even more unrestricted than metaphysical possibility. Just imagine a character who violates the law of no contradiction. You might, and when we reach the objections to the theory, you might ask, but what about canon? What is the function of canon? What happens to authority? My intuition here is that our ideas of canon and of a genuine or sanctioned presentation or version of a fictional character have more to do with concerns about intellectual property than with authentic ontological considerations. We might dismiss a certain version or guise of a given fictional character because it goes against the standard or official version, normally the one described by the original author. But it seems to me that property rights are more parochial and less metaphysically charged than fiction making. It is usually the case that property rights expire way before a fictional character ceases to exist. And to suppose that a change in a concrete human law would entail an ontological transfiguration for fictional characters would be perhaps to take such human affairs a bit too seriously. Establishing a set of essential fictional properties for a fictional character seems to be at best arbitrary. Even the original authors can change their minds sometimes, and they should be free to do so, as other authors should be free to reinterpret and represent existing fictional characters. Fiction making is a social practice. Storytelling is essentially a social activity. To defend authorial legitimacy to the point of turning fictional characters into immutable, unreachable entities would be perhaps to distort a human bond that is evidently prior to any individualistic, private conception of property. You cannot truly own the products of human imagination, as you cannot really limit its power for creation and recreation. Given that I have argued about our discourse on fiction, I hope to have shown that this descriptive semantics wouldn't properly capture the way we talk about fictional characters. There is, no doubt, a set of commonly associated descriptions for fictional characters. The boy who lived, Harry's best friend, the headmaster of Hogwarts. However, if our reference was determined by such descriptions, we would run into two problems. First, since fictional characters do not really have the properties they are ascribed in fiction, it would be hard to make sense of how such descriptions guarantee reference. And second, even if we granted that, for example, such properties are ascribed only in the fiction, perhaps by means of an implicit linguistic operator, for example, this would come with a problematic consequence of an over-multiplication of characters and/or an unwanted level of indeterminacy. A blonde guised Mrs Coulter is not the same character as a brunette guised Mrs Coulter. Or imagine a version in which Harry's best friend is Malfoy and not Ron. To whom would we be referring to? For these reasons, I argue that our directly referential semantics reflects how we speak of fictional characters qua fictional characters, and how, when we speak of them according to the fiction, we do it because we think of fictional characters qua presented as. Think of the relation between being and being represented as. I'm 28 years old, but I can be represented as being 45 years old. To be represented as a 45-year-old is not to assert of me that I am 45 years old. I'm using the predicate presented as and not represented as in the case of fictional characters because I do have certain properties or a certain guise, so to speak, in which or with which I'm already presented. I already appear to people, to the world, in a certain way. Fictional characters, abstract as they are presented each time, sometimes anew, though not always, in the fiction. Each time they appear in the fiction, they are presented. A final objection might be raised against accepting fictional characters in our ontology. However, such an objection would go against the general category of an abstract artifact. Though it is beyond the scope of this presentation to offer a defense of the existence of abstract artifacts, I would only say the following remarks. Even the strictest ontologies allow for the existence of certain kinds of abstract objects. usually sets, numbers, or other mathematical entities. It is argued that these entities are either indispensable and/or belong to metaphysically respected categories. I cannot successfully argue here neither for the indispensability of cultural artifacts nor for the legitimacy of that category. However, the ontological commitment seems rather minimal, a rather minimal price to pay for the explanatory power of the theory. The artifactual theory does not push us to revise our intuitions about fiction, and since those intuitions are grounded in the fiction-making practice itself, it does not require us to revise our fiction-making practice either. Our thought and talk of fictional characters inform and the structure of fiction-making practices and vice versa. It would be weird to suppose that we're radically mistaken about what is essentially a cultural practice. Our intuitions are there not only because of the practice, they guide the practice itself as well. In conclusion, if there are cultural artifacts, fictional characters are best understood as being that, cultural artifacts. Such fictional characters have none of the properties they are described with in the fiction, and even in the fiction, none of those properties are essential to them. The names of fictional characters, places, and items function very much the same way as the names of actual non-fictional entities. Thank you.